Good afternoon and welcome to this week's CERIAS Security Seminar at Purdue University. Today's speaker is Jack Jones. He's been employed in technology for 25 years, specializing in information security and risk management the past 18. He's worked in the military, government intelligence, consulting, and within the financial and insurance industries, including 5 years as a CISO for a Fortune 100 financial services company. He was recognized at the 2006 RSA with the ISSA Excellence in the Field of Security Practices Award. And in 2007, he was a finalist for the Central United States Information Security Executive of the Year Award. As a member of an international ISACA task force, he's currently helping to develop global standards for IT risk management. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Jack Jones.
Thank you very much. Before I get into the meat of the presentation, I'd like to ask you what you might think this picture represents. It represents, in my experience, the business executive who just realized his next meeting is with one of us, a security professional. And you can tell he's really excited and thrilled at this prospect, right? And he's really excited and thrilled because in his experience, he's about to meet with this person, or he might as well be. All right, somebody speaking a very different language, maybe expressing, trying to get the executive to buy into things through fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and best practices that the tribe down the road follows, and Grandpa followed, and that sort of thing. So, with that as kind of a backdrop. What I'll share with you today is the experience I've had over the last number of years in bringing security into alignment with risk management. And I say that because in my experience, it is very rare for an executive manager to care about security. I'm not sure I've ever met one. What they care about is risk. And there's an important difference between the two. So that's what I'll be talking about today, is kind of laying out my view of the differences between the two and my experience in making the shift between a security professional and a risk management professional, and more importantly, shifting that perspective and that approach within a large information security program in a very large company, and some of the successes we had there. I'll probably talk a little bit about some of the challenges we had too. So, as I said, we'll cover the difference between security and risk. Talk about making the shift and some use case examples, and then some of the benefits that fell out of that. So, risk versus security, what's the difference? And before I get into the specific differences too, let me share my first experience in my own lack of education on the topic. So I was the new CISO at Nationwide Insurance. And one of the first things you have to do as a new CISO is develop a strategy and then go beg for money. And so I developed my strategy and I went on my begging tour. And one of the senior executives that I sat down across from listened politely and then said, "So tell me, Jack, how much risk do we have?" Now, if he'd asked me, "Well, tell me more about the security problems we have," I could have talked all day. But he asked, "How much risk do we have?" I literally shrugged my shoulders and said, "Lots." And he said, "So if I spend this $12 million you're asking for, how much less risk will I have?" Less. As you might imagine, in an insurance company, that wasn't the ideal response. But I managed to get my money, and we did great things with it. But I left the meeting with my first taste of not understanding the difference between security and risk management, and realizing that there was a difference, at least in the eyes of management, and I'd better understand that if I'm going to be successful. So I've spent the last number of years evolving my own understanding of the difference and trying to become better at risk management and understanding where security plays and the role we play in that. So risk versus security, what's the difference? Very simply, and I won't spend a lot of time getting into this, but security has this notion of protecting. All right? And a lot of times, definitions for security include statements like protecting against the possibility of harm or freedom from danger. Right? Well, first of all, there's no such thing as freedom from danger. That doesn't exist in the real world, all right? And we'll talk about possibility and probability in a minute, but that use of the term possibility is a subtle but important difference between a security perspective and a risk management perspective. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. And then risk, as I've defined it, is the probable frequency and probable magnitude of future loss. In other words, how often bad things are likely to happen and how bad they're likely to be. Now, there are a couple of important things to notice with regard to that. First, the use of the term probable. All right, so we have a probability issue. All right, but maybe more importantly, there's probabilities not only around the frequency of events, but also the magnitude of events. One of the things I've commonly seen and been guilty of more times than I care to think about in the past is characterizing a risk scenario for management. And even if I'm treating the event frequency as a probability, generally what we don't do is treat loss magnitude as a probability. We almost always communicate the worst case possible outcome. And worst case almost never happens. In all my years in security, I have been witness to more incidents than I care to think about, all right? Not one even closely came to worst case outcome. Not close. So if we're characterizing, the risk condition to management and all we're doing is talking about worst case outcomes, we're inflating the risk statement, which is not allowing them to make a well-informed decision. And we're not doing our jobs then, all right? So, more about this. Information security, another consideration is information security is just one of the ways in which you can manage risk. You'll hear about, some people talk about transferring risk or avoiding risk and these sorts of things. So this is just one way for management to manage the frequency and magnitude of harm. The other consideration is that outside of a risk management context, security has no purpose, no meaning. I have yet to have someone give me a reason to do security things outside of the context of managing the frequency or magnitude of loss. So security is a subcomponent, if you will, of a risk management strategy. So making the shift. As I alluded to, one of the first things I had to do was come to terms with this whole probability issue, especially versus possibility. So possibility is binary. Something is possible or it's not. All right? Some people would make the argument that given enough time, anything is possible, right? Enough monkeys at a keyboard and you get, the works of Shakespeare or whatever, right? But bottom line, from a practical perspective, things are feasibly possible or they're not. Probability runs the continuum between the two. And this is where we provide real value, is being able to communicate that to management. Let me give you an example. Let's say, it's a little bit of a gory example, but it works. Let's say I'm in the unfortunate circumstance of having to play Russian roulette. The good news is I get to choose between weapons. My choice is between a standard 6-cylinder revolver with a single bullet loaded and chambered. My other option is a semi-automatic with a single bullet loaded and chambered. The possibility is equal. It is 100% possible in both circumstances for me to have an unfortunate outcome. All right? The probabilities are real different. And as a decision maker, don't bother me with possibilities. That doesn't help me. The hackers could get you. Duh. All right? That doesn't help me. Talk to me about probabilities. The walls could come crumbling down around you if the hackers get you. Duh. All right? Tell me about probabilities. What's the probable loss magnitude? That's the only kind of information that helps me. Yes, I need to know what the worst case might look like. But if that's a remote possibility, remote probability, caught myself, that difference is important. All right? So we have to treat these things as probabilities, or we're not helping our management, the people who are using the information we provide, make well-informed decisions. All right? And the difference, roughly 100%. I might get lucky and it misfires, or roughly 17%. All right, so Next thing I have to do is understand the problem space, risk. And I'm going to go through this step by step, and there won't be a test later. At least I won't be giving you a test later. But essentially there are the two halves, the loss event frequency and the loss magnitude side of the house. All right, we'll talk about these. So, risk, we've already talked about the probable frequency and probable magnitude of future loss. And we have loss event frequency, the probable frequency within a given time frame that a threat agent will inflict harm upon an asset. Now, something that's important is this notion of time frame. We have to time box it, again, because otherwise we're talking about possibilities, especially in rare events, right? So if we're evaluating risk around some rare event, right, and we say, well, you know, it could happen once, it could happen twice, once or twice in how many years? In order to compare that from a frequency perspective to the other risk issues we might be facing, we have to be able to make that distinction. So we have to time frame it. And typically what we do is, you know, frequency per year. Now that frequency may be a fraction, right? It may be 0.01 times per year, or in other words, once every 100 years, right? But that's an effective way of approaching that. Now, something else I'll point out here now is you will see risk analysis methodologies that don't use a frequency sort of statement, they use a likelihood statement. And again, unless there are challenges associated with likelihood in the sense that virus events within an organization are likely. So it's 100% likely that you'll have a virus event of some sort in any sizable organization. Fraud is likely in large organizations. So you could have 100% likelihood of fraud. But unless you talk about frequency, you can't draw those distinctions. And again, if we're going to be effective at this, we have to be able to draw the distinction. So I'm not an advocate of likelihood. Frequency is a more accurate and useful means of reflecting that aspect of our problem. Threat event frequency. So loss event frequency is driven by one or more factors. In this case, threat event frequency. How many, if we're talking about a malicious scenario, how many times are we attacked? It's also driven by vulnerability, the probability of being able to resist that attack. Okay? Now, something that's useful and important to recognize here is loss event frequency cannot exceed threat event frequency. If I'm attacked 10 times and 100% vulnerable, I have 10 loss events, right? But that vulnerability is represented as a ratio or a fraction, all right? So if I am 10% vulnerable, in other words, vulnerable to 10% of the attacks, and there are 10 attacks, there's one loss event, all right? Very straightforward, simple sort of relationships there. Threat event frequency is driven by contact with the threat community or communities. And again, it's probable frequency within a given time frame. Now, there are different types of contact. There's random, regular, and intentional. Random, did they trip over you? Regular, are they, say, the cleaning crew and they come through here regularly? Or are they hunting you, the intentional? All right? Probability of action. All right, so contact takes place, but that doesn't mean an attack or an act takes place, right? And so you have to have a probability of action. That probability of action is driven by a clicker. There we go. Value from the perspective of the attacker. What's in it for them? If you think about it, attackers are not much different than, say, the executives or you and us. We take actions based on the value, our perception of the value of that act, our perception of the level of effort surrounding that attack in this case, and a perception of how much risk exists for them. And we'll talk more about that in a minute because there's some real interesting implications from that perspective. So more on that in a minute. So we have some contact frequency and we have, again, a ratio, probability of action that provides us with our threat event frequency. And threat event frequency combined with vulnerability gives us loss event frequency. Fairly straightforward. It gets a little more interesting now. We talk about vulnerability. So vulnerability, the two factors that drive that are threat capability, all right, the force the threat agent is able to apply, And in a human context, that boils down to skill and resources. And that skill breaks down into knowledge and experience. Resources basically breaks down to time and materials. What's important about that is if you understand those factors and you're in a defensive role, then those are opportunities for managing the threat agent, the risk associated with that threat agent. If you understand that time and materials is a factor, can you reduce the available time they have to execute? Can you reduce their availability of resources and these sorts of things? So understanding these factors and where they play into the taxonomy is very important if we want to be particularly effective in managing our risk. And then control strength is essentially our ability to resist the force being applied. Now, one of the first questions that people ask then, is how do you measure that exactly? There isn't a pounds per square inch measurement for, hackers and that sort of thing. It might be interesting to try to develop one. Maybe there's a research project in there somewhere. But what I've come up with is a simple approach. And control strength basically boils down to difficulty and complexity. And I differentiate between the two because the request, hand me that piano, right, it's not a complex action, but if that's a grand piano, it may not be a simple act to give it to the person. So the notion of difficulty versus complexity, there's a subtle difference there that can be important. But in terms of measuring vulnerability, if we think about threat capability as a continuum from theoretical 0 to goodness knows where, infinite potentially, right? The population of threat agents exists as a distribution somewhere along that continuum, right? And you'll note that that continuum doesn't have any sort of markings or scale or anything associated, and we don't need it, right? So if we have this distribution of threat agents with some capability distribution, and it's generally going to be bell-shaped, although the shape may be narrower or broader depending on the circumstance, then you apply a control to that. So let's say we're talking about desencryption, a dozen years ago. At that time, the proportion of that threat community that lived on the wrong side, if you will, of that control was non-existent or nearly non-existent from a brute force attack perspective. Of course, over time, that tends to change. All right? So now desencryption is vulnerable to some percentage of that threat population. All right? That percentage exists at the higher end of the distribution. All right? Now, right there we could measure, if you will, vulnerability as that proportion of that distribution that is capable of compromising that control. So in this case, it might be 5% or whatever that happens to be on that curve. Now, because we can't measure that control strength precisely, at least in my experience, we can make estimates or measurements around that and describe that as a distribution as well. This control could be as minimally effective as this, maximally as this, and probably in this range. Describe that as a curve, and then you can use things like Monte Carlo analyses and stuff to generate an output distribution that represents the vulnerability for that control against that threat community. So that's an approach for measuring vulnerability that gets around this problem of an absence of scale and such, and is very effective. So on to the loss magnitude side of the house. Now, the loss magnitude side of the house is more complex than the loss event frequency side. The loss event frequency is nice and straightforward in most respects. This side is a lot more complex. There's more systemic effects, feedback loops, and that sort of thing. Bottom line, it's not as simple. And if we had more time, I could break that down a little deeper than what you'll see today, but this will give you a sense for it. So there are two primary categories of loss factors, primary and secondary. Primary loss factors have to do with asset characteristics, right? Things like criticality, cost, sensitivity of the assets. And then there are threat factors, things like the type of action taken, whether the threat agent is internal versus external. And the reason that's in there, and that's just an example, is because at least today, if an organization suffers some sort of security event and it was a trusted insider that perpetrated the event, the ramifications are different than if it was an external attacker. All right? So that difference is important in some circumstances. And then the competency issue gets to the point of, say, for example, someone who breaches security and takes away nuclear weapons information. Okay? Well, the breach occurred, but their ability to capitalize on that varies. They may have all the secrets in the world, but not have the materials, the skills, and resources to apply that in a way that generates nearly as much damage. So this notion of competency plays a role as well as one of the factors. And again, the factors I'm listing here are examples. There are more. Secondary loss factors are organizational considerations. Right? An example would be timing of the event. Is it year-end processing if you're a financial organization or something like that? Due diligence is a big one. Right? How effective have we been in situating ourselves to prevent this in the first place and then respond effectively? That due diligence is critical when we're dealing with reputation and legal loss magnitude issues. And then detection and response are critical. So an event occurs, how quickly did you detect it and respond to it so that you can contain it and minimize loss? So these are some of the organizational factors. And then environmental factors. And examples of those are laws and regulations, the media, and other stakeholders. Our competition and such play a role there. So this is kind of the fundamental breakdown, if you will, of this taxonomy at this layer of abstraction. It goes deeper. But when we're doing the analyses, and some people, when they see this taxonomy, they get a little wrapped up in, oh, that's complex. There's a ton of work there. Well, no, not really. First of all, once you get used to using it, it becomes second nature and is very quick to apply. Secondly, you can choose the level of abstraction you do your analysis in, and you might go deeper in the analysis in some circumstances when maybe there's more at stake and you want to be sure you haven't overlooked something, right? And other times you operate at a very high level of abstraction and you can do quick and dirty analyses and a good enough job for that circumstance, right? To apply your resources intelligently and stuff. So, don't let apparent complexity concern you, because you're in control of how complex you want to make it. Now, back to what I mentioned a little bit earlier. The probability of action is driven by value, level of effort, and risk from the threat agent's perspective. Okay. Now, what's interesting there is you see the bubble for risk there. Well, we've got a bubble there for risk, and we've got a bubble at the top for risk. What that means is we have the same taxonomy at that level, only from the aggressor's perspective. Okay? It's risk from their perspective. Loss event frequency, probability of getting caught. Loss magnitude, probable consequences with getting caught. What that allows us to do is some interesting analyses of the different aggressors we face and how we can affect that risk equation for them. All right? Likewise, as an aggressor, we can analyze our own circumstance relative to what we're trying to accomplish. So this has some interesting implications in, say, defense or those sorts of law enforcement or other environments where you're doing scenario analysis and trying to understand, say, your opponent's perspective. So I thought I'd share that. And by the way, if anybody has any questions throughout this, please don't hesitate to ask. Sometimes I get on a roll and people might be afraid of breaking my rhythm, and that's okay. So with this, understanding of probability versus possibility, and then developing this taxonomy so I have a decent understanding of risk, there was this transition that the organization had to go through to be risk-focused versus purely a security focus. We had to validate the approach, right? I wasn't going to presume, having developed this taxonomy and such, that I had a clue. So I took the taxonomy and the measurement approach and the use of, planning to use Bayesian analysis as the computational probabilistic analysis for it. And I thought, oh, I better get this validated by somebody because I could be on thin ice. So I took it to the actuaries, the vice presidents of the actuarial department for the company I worked for. And these people live and breathe risk and statistics and probability and such, and had them review it. And fortunately, they gave it 2 great big thumbs up and were very enthusiastic about it and such. So that was a good first vetting. Then I also had to take it in front of the auditors, both the internal auditors and external auditors, because they're the ones who are grading the organization at any given time on their risk management capabilities. And if they don't agree with it, if they don't see value in it, then you're really swimming upstream, and that's not something you want to do if you can avoid it. So I took it to them, and lo and behold, the internal folks liked it so much they had me train all their auditors in it. The external folks, which were one of the big 4 firms, they wanted to know more about it, and I only gave them enough to make them comfortable and wouldn't train them in it, unless they wanted to pay me. So at any rate, that level of vetting also took place. Then we had to train the people on my staff. And I was fortunate enough to have a lot of very sharp people in the organization. And so I went about training them in the nomenclature and the analysis approach and that sort of thing. And that was an interesting experience for me, because what I discovered was various mindsets respond differently to this approach. So for example, some folks who are particularly engineering focused, right? So they're very into numbers and precision, a lot of them, right? And that's a sweeping statement, but a lot of them are. And the concern I ran into occasionally with some folks like that was, well, if you can't measure it to 3 decimal points of precision, it's really not worth doing. Okay, well, that may be true in some circumstances, rocket science perhaps. But when you're talking about risk, precision is a pipe dream. Okay, there's no risk analysis that can defensively claim to be precise, because essentially risk is a projection of what could occur in the future, right? And that's a dicey proposition, right? So, so we had to overcome, some folks who came to the table with that mindset, and then there were other folks too who were very experienced security professionals and had always taken a very specific approach to security, right? And they'd built their reputations on it, and this is what they were comfortable with, and by God, that's the only way it was done, and anything new just couldn't be truthful, couldn't be useful. So, worked with them too. Good news is, of all the people I worked with and trained, they all eventually came around to my way of thinking. Maybe it's the fact they worked for me? No, that couldn't be it. So at any rate, but I had to train them and make them competent in the analysis, and that was an ongoing process. And we'll talk more about how that turned out. Then I had to educate management, all right? And this was really important because management was used to us coming to the table with statements of high risk, don't do that, all right? And then oftentimes not being able to really do a good job of defending that conclusion or that statement, all right? We'd fall back on, well, it's high risk because the walls could come crumbling down around us, the bad guys could get us, these sorts of things. Statements around possibility rather than probability. And again, management's used to dealing with risk as a probability issue. And so if you're not speaking to them in those terms, they don't understand it. So again, what they're used to is us coming to the table with these statements of, these Chicken Little statements, right? And oftentimes they would discount us then. They'd quit listening when we walked in the door. We had to tell them, no, we've changed our approach. This is how we're approaching it now. And so when we talk about something being high risk, there's numbers around that, and you probably want to pay attention. I'll talk more about that in one of the use case examples. And then we had to integrate it with our security processes. The things we do. Policy exceptions come in, right? As they always will. And the ability to analyze the risk associated with that and put that in a statement to management so they could make a decision as to whether to approve it and that sort of thing. And other examples, again, which we'll touch on in a minute. So those were some of the steps. Now, the use case examples I'm going to be sharing with you are the details have been changed to protect the innocent. All right, I can't share with you the details around them because they represent real risk for real companies. But I'll share enough and change the details enough that you'll get the gist and see how it was applied. So, in the beginning, we articulated risk in a very simple fashion for management when we first started using this. We essentially had a chart with two axes. You may have seen something similar to this where you have loss magnitude on one side and loss event frequency on the other, and the intersection is your risk point. Okay, and we used that at first, and it actually was very effective. And I'll show you one example of how we use that. Now we've evolved, and our analyses and the information we provide to management is a little different. And these are just some of the examples from one analysis we performed recently for somebody. But there are other ways of carving up the data. We can basically carve up our analyses in a whole lot of different ways and do all kinds of sensitivity testing and such that we weren't able to do originally. And again, if we had a lot more time, I could share some of that with you. But here's a simple example. There was a situation, one place, one client / employer, where we had identified a risk issue. And essentially, a rough approximation of the technology involved was we had a business partner connected to the internet, connected to our DMZ, connected to our core. Now, you look at that and you think, well, you have a DMZ, you have firewalls, that seems cool, okay. Well, yes, it would be, except there was also some of our consumer information in the business partners' offices in their network. All right, not a lot of it, but a little bit. All right, sensitive consumer information. Also, because of the nature in which they were connected to the DMZ, they were logically pretty much in the DMZ. So if you owned one of their workstations, you really were pretty much in the DMZ, and that first firewall was an expensive router. All right. Well, you're thinking, well, okay, but you still have a firewall between you and the core. Well, not really, because you're passing Microsoft protocols and some other protocols through there, so what you've got there is another really expensive router. All right? So you have essentially pass-through from the internet to the partner, to the DMZ, to the core. Now, there were some controls in place. It wasn't just wide open or anything like that, but there was still a significant amount of risk associated with this. Now, I managed to garner a grand total of 15 minutes with executive management on this issue. And the reason that was important was dealing with this was going to cost big bucks. Not only big bucks in terms of actual dollars and cents, but big bucks in terms of political capital in dealing with the partner, business partner. All right? It was not going to be a simple issue. And there was nobody under executive management that would begin to touch this as a result. So I weaseled 15 minutes with executive management. Now, as you might imagine, they don't have a lot of time to read stuff. I couldn't put together a 4-page or 6-page summary, you know, all verbiage, and expect them to read it. I mean, if it was going to be more than a page, they weren't going to read it, pay any attention to it. Science is relatively complex. What you're seeing here isn't so much, but the real scenario was more complex. And, you know, you try to describe that in verbiage, it's problematic, right? So what I did is I took a diagram, a single-page diagram similar to this, that had, you know, this sort of illustration of the elements in play, and then I characterized risk at each level. I may need a new battery in my clicker here. Okay, so there's certain risk level because of the information in the business partner location, right? There's risk at the DMZ level, and there's risk at the core. Now, the points here, point A, in the, let's see if I can, my mouse is not going to show up. point A, which you may or may not be able to see very clearly on the leftmost graph. It is the rightmost point on the leftmost graph or chart, is the current state. All right, high frequency, low impact, because there isn't a lot of data. There's some data, but not a lot of data. All right. If we applied a set of controls, we could drive that risk point to point B, reduce the frequency, and reduce impact a little bit. Okay. Now, what's interesting in this is the risk in the DMZ zone. What you're seeing there is point A is current state. There's a higher concentration of assets there, so the loss magnitude is greater. Loss event frequency is lower because there are some controls in place. But what's particularly interesting is point B. By applying the controls at the partner's location, you get a reduction in risk within the DMZ. No additional controls required within the DMZ. You apply the controls at the externalmost point, and you get this downstream reduction in risk. When I start talking about that, their ears perked up. So we only have to apply controls in one place, and we get reduction in risk elsewhere? I said, yeah. Same at the core. Again, huge, population of assets and high potential impact in the core, especially if a threat agent is going to make their way all the way to the core, they're probably up to no good in a serious way, and so the impact is likely to be much greater. But again, because there are some controls in place, the frequency around that is expected to be a lot less. But here again, by applying those controls at the periphery, we get a downstream reduction in risk at the core. So in 15 minutes, I took a diagram very much like this to management and had the commitment I needed to rectify the situation. So it was very effective as a communication tool. And again, it made sense to them. Another example. We had processes in place, and if you're familiar with best practices around processes, one of the things that they say organizations should have is integration into the system development lifecycle. All right? So security should be involved in technology projects and business projects, for that matter, from the word go, so that we can help them manage risk. Right? So we're not an 11th hour obstacle when they want to throw the switch and put something into production. If we haven't been involved, there may be huge issues, and then all of a sudden we're a roadblock. And let me tell you, management doesn't like us as a roadblock. They don't like us at all as a roadblock. And 99 times out of 100 as a roadblock, you're a speed bump. They don't stop. They go ahead anyway. They've committed budget and time, and their bonuses may be on the line and so on. So they don't, essentially you're an annoyance. So it's very important to be engaged in these projects up front. All right, so we had that in place. And we had that in place for a couple of years. And so we'd been involved in projects from the get-go, identifying risk issues and using Lord knows what to estimate the risk around those. All right? Before we had this risk-based approach, each security analyst in the organization had their own judgment around what the risk was for each issue they ran into. All right? And so what we did as we looked at applying this is we took a snapshot of all the risk issues that had been identified over 2 years and how they'd been characterized from a high, medium, or low risk perspective. And this is roughly the percentage. About 40%, high 30s, around 40% of the issues had been identified as high risk. What's the problem with that? Well, inconsistency for one thing. One person's high risk is another person's medium risk and that sort of issue. But the other is you put enough high risk issues in front of someone, they begin to not care anymore. They become desensitized. Oh, another high risk Chicken Little issue. Where do I sign off on this? They don't pay attention to that anymore. All right? But the problem with that is buried somewhere in those high risk issues are issues that executive does not want their name next to. But they have no way of differentiating those. So I trained up my analysts and we began tracking the change. And we had roughly a 2/3, almost 3/4 reduction in high-risk issues, which means management could focus on the issues that matter. All right? Now here again, this is where it became very important for us to let management know, all right, when we've changed how we do this, and when you see a high-risk issue in front of you now, pay attention. Now, we're still using this qualitative term high risk, but that's mapped back to predefined levels, all right, as approved by management. So these numbers equal high risk to them. So it makes it a simpler comparison. Management, they want numbers, they want there to be numbers, and they want rigor behind this stuff. But at the end of the day, a lot of times they want a stoplight, red, yellow, green sort of position, because they're in a hurry, right? And they don't have time to analyze a lot of numbers. But they really do like the fact that there's rigor and numbers behind the analysis. So in another case, we had one of the big four consulting firms come in and do an attack and penetration exercise. And they had a number of findings that they characterized as high risk. And I looked at those and just intuitively I said, oh, I don't think so. So I pushed back. And I said, I don't think these are high risk. And, well, we're the experts here. You brought us in. You're paying us a lot of money. Of course it's high risk. And I don't think so. So I went up to the whiteboard and we broke down each one of those issues. And at the end of the day, they conceded every point. Not one of those was truly high risk. Which means as an organization, we could be more cost effective in our applying resources to managing these issues. We didn't have to pull a fire alarm. We didn't have to stop production on things. We could be more deliberate and effective in dealing with the issues. And let me tell you, management loves that. They see tremendous value all of a sudden when you're able to provide that kind of clarity and opportunity to them. So, in another instance, we had identified a risk issue, significant risk issue that we thought needed to be addressed. And we analyzed 3 different approaches for mitigating that risk. Option A, best practice, and two approaches that you wouldn't characterize as best practice. It isn't common practice. After analysis, we determined option B was likely to be every bit as effective as best practice, but a whole lot less expensive. Guess which one management chose? And they were thrilled to have the opportunity to make that choice. Again, if all you come to the table with is best practice, everybody else does it this way. Sometimes that's going to be exactly the right thing to do. That may be the perfect solution for that circumstance. All right? Sometimes it's not. But as a responsible professional, it is critical that we can distinguish between the two when they're important and when it's the appropriate solution and when it's not. Don't get me wrong, best practice has an important role to play. But misused or abused, I refer to it as the lemming approach to risk management. All right? And it really feels that way sometimes. So, enough said about that. All right, so some of the benefits from taking this risk-based approach. Tangible benefits, and some of them are fairly obvious. More accurate information for management. Things aren't as inflated. All right? More useful information. And again, given more time, I could talk about things like distinguishing or identifying when there's fragility in the scenario. All right? Because you may have a situation where that risk point on that chart may look like it's in great shape. It may be low in the lower left quadrant, something like that. But it may be fragile. There may be one control that if it fails, that goes to heck in a handbasket. All right? That's a critical piece of information for management. All right? And then there's this notion of instability. You may have an environment where the threat event frequency is really low and your controls stink or don't exist, but because you have this low threat event frequency, you still have a low loss event frequency, and as a result, that risk point will be, potentially at the left side of the chart, or the left side of the graph. But what's going on there is you're rolling the dice every day. You're trusting the luck. That's an unstable condition. You're not in control of it. That is critical information for management. If all you come to the table with is this risk point or some statement of high, medium, or low, all right, you're not giving them enough information to make an informed decision. So these sorts of important points are fundamental to doing our jobs well and providing management with the information they need. Cost-effective solutions, cited that one example. Better able to prioritize. I mean, that's huge for organizations. As a practicing CISO for years, one of my biggest challenges was prioritization. I have way more to do than I have dollars and cents or political goodwill to get done. I have to know which is more important. Now, if amongst the things you have to do, you have education awareness and intrusion detection and identity and access management and blah, 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 all these different things that are dissimilar, right? How do you prioritize that? Right? The only way you can prioritize this is understanding the effect of each of those from a risk perspective. So, and then fewer fire drills, again, which gets down to being more cost-effective and prioritizing. The intangible benefits were important. For the people in my organization, they felt far more comfortable and confident in their ability to defend their conclusions and recommendations. And that was an intangible benefit to them as a professional. And the other intangible was the increased credibility for us as an organization within the business. Management viewed us differently. They came to us, we began being viewed as trusted advisors rather, which is a term that's overused, but it's an important thing. They began viewing us as someone there to help them rather than somebody there as an obstacle. You know, they're trying to manage risk with limited resources across a lot of different risk domains. They've got insurance risk and investment risk and market risk and goodness knows what other risks to deal with, all right? And IT and information risk is just another one of those silos for them to manage. And so their confidence in our ability to provide them with the means of being better at managing that was really important. And it changed the relationship. So, having said all that, anybody have any questions? Hopefully questions. Hard questions, easy questions, any question. If nobody asks questions, then I become afraid that y'all slept through this. And I saw eyes closed, but I figure you're just listening harder when your eyes are closed. I didn't hear anybody snoring. So,
Jack, I have a question, or actually more of a comment that struck me when you were talking, that just towards the end of your presentation when you talked about the Big Four accounting firm came in, made suggestions of best practices and things to be do, you pushed back and they conceded on some of these points. You had to have had some sleepless nights that had maybe a low probability of something happening, but a high impact event that happened, and the C-level and the company would have said, this is exactly what the big accounting firm, the big consulting firm said we needed to guard against, assuming that one of their best practices had to adjust this. You had to cause yourself some very sleepless nights that even though if you'd have gone against the experts, that you're putting your neck out there.
Yeah, that was concern. There was risk from my perspective in going down this road and developing this stuff and relying on it. And yes, especially at first, I wrestled with that a lot. And especially when I would come up against my own demons, if you will, where I would have been I had for years practiced security in this fashion, and now I'm learning that, you know what, I was doing it wrong in that aspect of it. That didn't feel good. And I challenged myself. I said, well, I can't have been wrong for all those years. It must be the new stuff I'm developing that's wrong. And I would beat that up pretty thoroughly, trying to, become comfortable with the result. And in every instance, I've been wrong all along. But, to your point, yes, there was that concern about if I made some risk statement and something bad happened because management, had gone against best practice because of my risk analysis. I managed that risk by, again, informing them of the method of my analysis, making sure they knew it was not a precise statement, that there were probabilities both in terms of frequency and impact, right? And that there are always tail events, right? These black swan events, whatever you want to call them, these things that can come out of the blue. And at the end of the day, I actually sleep better with this than I ever did before. Because I view my role as that of an educator first for management. All right? I'm there to help them make well-informed decisions. That is my first and most important job. And I feel far more confident in my ability to do that today than I ever was able to before. And because of the nature of the relationship, it used to be that I would say, this is what you must do. Right? Now I'm coming to them and saying, here's the risk associated with it. Here are your options. Make a choice. Right? And here, the ramifications of these options and that sort of thing. And so they would be making a choice, and as long as I felt I had done a good job of providing them with information, the best job I was able to, I slept great. And could organizations, being what they are, had the black swan event occurred, they might very well have pointed their bony finger at me and said, be gone. If that's how they operate as a business, then probably best that I go anyway. But
that's how many organizations.
That's how they work. And I felt more ethical in this approach than just being a lemming and saying, no, protect against any eventuality. Must spend money, must spend money. I don't feel like I'm doing my job. I'm not helping the organization be effective, because the other side, the flip side to risk, is opportunity. And money and resources spent on managing risk is money and resources not available to making money for the organization. Or if you're, say, the government, to, providing additional benefits or protecting the country better or whatever the case may be. So, I feel like this approach is the only truly defensible approach to the bigger issue of, making the best use of the resources that are available. And is it precise? Is it flawless? Oh, heavens no. But I would argue that is more effective than a Chicken Little approach, and in many cases, especially in specific scenarios, it's far more effective than blindly following best practice. But that's a great question. Yes?
Have you ever felt like when you're going before management to tell them what you really believe that they should do, that you're kind of sticking your neck out there?
Oh, yeah. Don't become a CISO if you've got thin skin and no tolerance for risk. Because your neck is constantly on the line, to your point also. But there are lots of, taking this before management, you're always being assessed, as a management or leader within the company. The executives are always kind of checking you out, and so you got a clue, these sorts of things. Did he lead me astray last time, or that sort of thing. So, yeah, you're always dealing with personal risk, and you have to be comfortable with that, or you probably want to be in a different line of work. Some people would say that it is safer to just follow the party line and, best practice, best practice, best practice. It's like the old phrase, you never get fired for hiring IBM, I know a specific exception to that. It's a friend of mine. but that may be true, but I don't think it's ethical, is my perspective. It's a coward's approach or something, but good question. Yes?
Do you think that these risk assessment methods could be adapted to domains outside of information security, like airport or bank security?
Absolutely. In fact, the approach is agnostic with regard to risk domain, and it is particularly effective for operational risk type issues. So those could be things like IT risk other than security related. They can be things like legal risk issues. In one place I worked, we used this method to analyze legal risk issues outside of IT or security, and it worked very well. Management was thrilled with it. We've had some experience in leveraging it to help companies do enterprise risk management. Now, you may not be familiar with enterprise risk management, but it's this concept where you've got all these different risk silos in an organization, insurance, investment market, and security, and all these different things. And management has decided they want a single view of all the risk. They want a dashboard view of risk from all these domains. And that is just terribly difficult to do because all these different domains treat risk just a little bit differently and they use different terminologies. And so it's almost impossible to normalize data and roll up anything meaningful. But what this can serve as, and what we're exploring with enterprise risk management organizations, is using this as a normalizing layer between these, the data sources from these different risk management silos, and allowing us to normalize the data and then roll it up. So bottom line, yeah, it's broadly applicable and seems to have a lot of promise in that regard. Yes, sir.
Some or maybe most of the students receiving this class are going to end up having a career in information security. Considering your experience, how do you advise our students to deal with this dilemma? If nothing happens, it means the CISO doesn't have a job. If something bad happens, the CISO is in trouble.
Yeah.
How they're supposed to deal with this thing?
So the question, and I'm not sure, was the mic on, do you know, for that?
Yeah.
Okay. So, how do you deal with that aspect of it? If nothing bad goes on, they spent too much, and were you really necessary in the first place? And if something bad happens, then where were you anyway, and why have I paid you anything, right? Again, that kind of comes with the territory. And so you have to, the practical reality is some organizations, the cultures in some organizations are going to look for a scapegoat. And they aren't going to think deeply enough about your value proposition to recognize what you bring to the table even when something bad doesn't happen. But a couple of things. First of all, something bad always will happen. You will have incidents to deal with, guaranteed. All right? Most of them hopefully will be smaller, all right? Some of them will not be, all right? But there will be incidents, and you will have an opportunity to do a couple of things when those incidents occur. You'll have an opportunity to manage them, right, and manage the impact they have, and that's a great place to fall flat on your face or to excel. Okay? Secondly, if all you're doing is following a checklist of best practices, then it is a very fair question, why am I paying you anything? A grade school graduate can follow a checklist. It doesn't take an MBA to follow a checklist. All right? If you want to apply critical thinking skills, if you want to, deal with complex issues, not black and white issues, none of our issues are black and white, they're all gray. If you want to deal with them effectively, all right, you apply critical thinking skills. That's what we get paid for, at least what we get paid well for. And so it's a very fair question. If you're not performing that way, if you're treating it as a checklist issue, black and white, why are you there? They can get anybody to do that. All right? But when you start dealing with management and bringing complex issues to them, explaining it clearly, providing them with options, helping them reduce and manage costs and that sort of thing, if bad things don't happen, you've still shown value. Right? And so you've put yourself in a better position there. Mm-hmm.
Quick question.
Yes, sir.
With the caveat knowing that every company is different and everybody's risks are different, can you pinpoint a common practice that everybody assumes is a best practice that almost across the board, regardless of who you talk to, is one of those things that can probably fall in that it's not the most effective thing you can do for security?
Well, I can come close to that. I can tell you that in exceedingly rare circumstance, it is exceedingly rare for companies to do any sort of logging or intrusion detection that matters. All right? They will spend boatloads of money on storage for logs. They will spend boatloads of money on, fancy intrusion detection systems, and then nobody pays any attention to that data, those systems. It is one of the biggest places of wasted resource that I consistently see. Intrusion detection, log monitoring, and that sort of thing has tremendous value to add, but it is not cheap, and it goes way beyond the cost of the device. All right. So, and there are going to be some organizations where it's clearly more valuable than others, but that is where I see the most money wasted. Great question. Any others? I know you guys probably are chomping the bit to get going, but questions are good. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.